Kathy Vanderot, the girl once envied by all, stood humiliated at the altar, jilted by her groom. In the stunned silence, she threw out words she didn't mean. "I'll marry whoever will have me today." To everyone's shock, Jack Alden, the reclusive billionaire who refused every social invitation and kept the world at arm's length, a man she hadn't seen since childhood, stepped forward as though it had always been his place. The morning had begun with promise. Kathy Vanderot stood before gilded mirrors in her childhood estate, wrapped in ivory silk and French lace, while a dozen hands fussed over her veil. She was marrying Trevor Ashford, charming, well-connected Trevor, who had courted her with weekend trips to the Hamptons and promises whispered over champagne. He came from new money, tech fortune made in his father's generation, and he'd pursued Kathy with the kind of determined charm that had worn down her hesitations over 18 months. Her parents approved. Society approved, and Kathy, desperate to prove she could claim the life expected of her, had said yes to his proposal on a yacht in the Mediterranean, surrounded by witnesses who would ensure the engagement appeared in all the right publications. The church overflowed with 300 guests, each representing a thread in the tapestry of old money and new influence. White roses cascaded from every pillar, their perfume thick and cloying in the June heat. A string quartet played Pachelbel as Kathy took her father's arm, her heart pounding beneath layers of tulle and silk that had cost more than most people's cars. She'd dreamed of this moment since childhood. The walk down the aisle, the admiring gasps, the feeling of being chosen, valued, claimed by someone who mattered. Trevor mattered. He sat on boards, managed investments, appeared in Forbes under 30 lists. He was everything a Vanderot daughter should want. But when she reached the altar, Trevor's eyes held something she couldn't name. Panic, perhaps, or regret. His hands trembled as he took hers, and she felt the cold sweat on his palms through her lace gloves. The officiant cleared his throat, beginning the familiar words. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." Trevor's grip tightened, then released entirely. "I can't do this." The words barely escaped his lips. But in the hushed reverence of the church, they rang like gunshots. Kathy's mind went blank, unable to process what she'd just heard. "Trevor?" Her voice sounded small, childlike. He stepped back, his face pale, eyes wild. "I'm sorry. I can't. I thought I could, but I can't." He turned. He walked. Down the aisle, past gasping guests, past Kathy's mother who half rose from her seat with a strangled sound, past the groomsmen who stood frozen in matching gray tuxedos, past the life they were supposed to build together. The heavy oak doors closed behind him with terrible finality. Kathy stood frozen, the world narrowing to a pinpoint. The bouquet of white peonies slipped from her fingers, hitting the marble floor with a soft thud. 300 pairs of eyes burned into her skin. Whispers erupted like wildfire. Did he just leave her? At the altar? Oh my God, poor thing. How absolutely humiliating. What will she do now? The Vanderots must be mortified. The heat of shame crawled up her neck, staining her cheeks red beneath the veil. Her vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. Not to her. Not to Kathy Vanderot, who'd done everything right, who'd been beautiful and accomplished and perfect, according to every measure that mattered in their world. Her father reached for her arm, murmuring something about leaving, about going somewhere private, but she heard none of it. The rushing in her ears drowned out everything except the crushing weight of humiliation, of being so worthless that a man would rather face public scandal than marry her. And in that moment of raw desperation, needing to feel anything other than abandoned and worthless, needing to prove that she could be wanted, she heard herself speak. "I'll marry whoever will have me today." The words escaped before rational thought could stop them. Her voice rang clear through the church, shocking her with its steadiness when everything inside her was crumbling. The whispers cut off abruptly. The church fell into a silence so complete she could hear the rustling of her dress, the hammering of her pulse. Her father's grip tightened on her elbow. "Kathy, no!" But she pulled away, chin lifted in defiance against the mortification threatening to drown her. Let them stare. Let them judge. At least she wouldn't walk out of here as the girl too worthless to marry. Then, from the third row on the groom's side, A figure stood, Jack Alden. The murmur that swept through the church was different now, shock mixed with disbelief. Jack Alden, who'd declined every invitation to every social event in the 5 years since he'd returned to the city. Jack Alden, who built his family's moderate fortune into a billion-dollar empire through tech investments and real estate developments, all while maintaining an almost mythical reclusiveness. Jack Alden, who granted no interviews, attended no galas, appeared at no charity functions despite the astronomical checks he wrote to various causes. Jack Alden, who was here only because his mother Margaret had physically dragged him, insisting that the Vanderrots were old family friends and his absence would be inexcusably rude after they'd invited him personally. His voice cut through the chaos, steady and certain. "I will," Kathy's breath caught. She hadn't seen him since they were children. Since before his family moved to California when he was 12. Since before the years had transformed the quiet boy who once followed her, through garden parties into this man with sharp cheekbones and shoulders that filled his expertly tailored charcoal suit. He walked toward her, each step measured, unhurried, as though he had all the time in the world, and the 300 stunned guests simply didn't exist. The crowd erupted in urgent whispers, but Jack seemed to hear none of it. His eyes stayed fixed on Kathy, dark and unreadable. When he reached the altar, he stood beside her as though it were the most natural thing in the world. Up close, she could see the man he'd become, the strong line of his jaw, the faint scar above his left eyebrow, the way his presence seemed to command the space around him without effort. "You don't have to," Kathy began, her voice shaking now that the shock was wearing off. "I know," he said simply. His gaze held hers, and she saw no pity there. No judgment, only something ancient and unshakable, something that made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. The officiant stammered, looking between them with wide eyes. This is highly irregular. We're both of legal age and sound mind," Jack said calmly, never looking away from Kathy. "We both consent." "That's all that's required, isn't it?" The officiant swallowed hard and began improvised vows while Kathy's mind raced. Was this madness? Charity? Or had Jack Alden just become the only person in the world who saw her as something more than broken? They signed the papers in a side room adjacent to the church vestry, away from the chaos of 300 guests trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Kathy's hand trembled so violently she could barely hold the pen, her signature coming out jagged and barely legible across the marriage certificate. Jack's signature flowed steady and certain below hers, his handwriting strong and clear, as though he'd already made peace with this choice long before entering the church. Her parents appeared in the doorway, her mother's face pale beneath expertly applied makeup, her father's expression caught between shock and something that might have been relief. At least this was better than the alternative, better than their only daughter walking out of the church utterly unwanted, better than the scandal of Trevor's abandonment standing alone without the distraction of this new, even more shocking development. Her mother embraced her tightly, whispering, "We'll get through this. The Alden name is still respected. His fortune is substantial. It isn't what we planned, but it's not a disaster." The words were meant to comfort, but they landed hollow. A reminder that even this impulsive marriage was being measured by standards of social acceptability and financial security. Her father shook Jack's hand with grim approval, his grip firm and assessing. "I trust you understand the gravity of what you've just done, Alden." "I understand perfectly, sir," Jack replied, his tone respectful but unbending. "I wouldn't have done it otherwise." Guests filtered into the reception hall at the Vanderrot estate. The celebration had been planned for months, vendors paid, food prepared. Canceling would have been both wasteful and an admission of complete defeat. So the impossible wedding reception proceeded, transforming from Trevor's carefully orchestrated event into something far more surreal. Kathy moved through it all in a daze, feeling the weight of Jack's presence beside her like an anchor in a storm she hadn't known was coming. He never strayed more than a few feet away, a constant, solid presence that somehow made the whispers and stares slightly more bearable. She remembered fragments of the boy he'd been, memories surfacing from years she'd almost forgotten. Jack at 7, trailing behind her at her 9th birthday party in the Vanderot Gardens, carrying the pink ribbon that had fallen from her hair without being asked, presenting it to her with solemn ceremony. Jack at 10, reading in corners while other children played elaborate games, but always watching her with those serious dark eyes that seemed to see more than a child should. Jack at 12, the last summer before his family moved across the country, when he'd helped her climb the old oak tree behind her house despite her designer dress, and caught her when she slipped, his hands steady even as hers shook. That boy had been soft-spoken, gentle, easily overlooked among the louder, brasher children of their social circle. Adults had patted his head and remarked on what a serious little thing he was, never quite knowing what to make of a child who preferred observation to participation. But the man beside her now radiated something entirely different, a quiet authority that made people step aside without him uttering a word. His suit fit perfectly across shoulders that had broadened with time and, she suspected, disciplined exercise. His jaw had sharpened, his features settling into the kind of masculine beauty that came from good bones and better genetics. His presence commanded space in ways the child never had, never could have. When business associates approached, men who controlled hedge funds and tech companies, they treated Jack with the kind of respect reserved for equals, perhaps even superiors. She heard snippets of their conversations, references to deals he'd orchestrated, investments that had paid off spectacularly, a recent acquisition that had made headlines in the financial press. "You don't have to stay," Kathy whispered, when they found themselves momentarily alone near the champagne fountain, the crystal glasses catching afternoon light and throwing rainbows across the white tablecloths. "We can annul this next week. Say we were both in shock, that it wasn't legally binding because—" Jack turned to her, his expression unreadable in that way she was beginning to recognize as his default. "Is that what you want?" "I don't know what I want." Her voice cracked despite her best efforts. "I just humiliated myself in front of everyone who matters. I threw myself at anyone who would have me like some desperate—" "You did nothing wrong," he interrupted quietly. "Trevor humiliated you. There's a difference. Everyone will remember me as the girl so pathetic she had to beg someone to marry her at her own wedding. Then let me offer you this," he said, and something in his tone made her look up, meeting his eyes fully for the first time since they'd signed the papers. "A real marriage. Not an annulment. Not a temporary arrangement. A genuine commitment, for as long as you'll have it. We build something together. Something neither of us planned but both of us choose. Intentionally. Daily." She studied his face, searching for the catch, the hidden agenda. Men like Jack Alden didn't marry discarded brides out of kindness. Men like him guarded their freedom more fiercely than their fortunes. He could have anyone. Women threw themselves at billionaires, especially ones who looked like him, who carried themselves with that particular blend of confidence and mystery. "Why would you do this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "You don't know me anymore. We were children. You don't owe me anything." His eyes held hers with an intensity that made her throat tighten, made her acutely aware of how close he stood, of the warmth radiating from him despite the formal distance he maintained. "Because I made a vow today, and I don't break vows. Catherine." The use of her full name, spoken in his low voice, sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. The reception blurred around them after that. Clinking glasses, forced laughter, the string quartet playing on as though the world hadn't just tilted sideways. Jack never left her side. When guests approached with barely concealed curiosity, he deflected their intrusions with polite efficiency, his responses courteous, but offering no opening for deeper interrogation. When her mother's friends whispered just loudly enough to be heard, "Poor dear, at least the Alden boy has money," he positioned himself between Kathy and their judgment, his body a physical barrier against their cruelty. Later, in the bridal suite that had been prepared for a different groom, Kathy stood by the window still in her wedding dress and caught Jack's reflection in the mirror as he paused at the door. The way he looked at her, not with pity or obligation, but with something far more dangerous, something that made her realize the boy who once followed her had grown into a man who might consume her entirely. There was no tropical escape, no private island retreat, no week of anonymous luxury where they could hide from what they'd done. Instead, Kathy and Jack returned to the reception that had transformed from Trevor's carefully planned celebration into something far more surreal. A wedding breakfast for a marriage no one had anticipated, least of all the bride and groom themselves. The Vanderot estate's grand ballroom had been decorated for months, every detail reflecting Trevor's preference for modern elegance over traditional opulence: white orchids instead of roses, sleek geometric centerpieces instead of elaborate floral arrangements, a jazz quartet instead of classical strings. Kathy looked at it all now and felt nothing. These choices had been Trevor's, rubber-stamped by her because she'd been so desperate to be agreeable, to be the kind of woman a man like him would want. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was now celebrating her marriage to a completely different man in a venue designed to please the one who'd abandoned her, the Ashford. Family had departed within 30 minutes of the ceremony, Trevor's mother tight-lipped and furious, his father avoiding eye contact entirely as they made their swift exit. Their absence left a vacuum that only fueled the gossip machine. Where had Trevor gone? Why had he truly left? Had there been someone else? Had he discovered something about Kathy? The speculation would fuel society columns for weeks, perhaps months, but the Vanderot's closest friends remained, bound by social obligation and morbid curiosity to witness how this impossible union would unfold. They picked at their plated meals: herb-crusted salmon and filet mignon, Trevor's choices again, while stealing glances at the newlyweds seated at the head table. Jack navigated it all with the same detached competence he likely brought to boardrooms and business negotiations. When elderly Mrs. Pemberton approached with sugar-coated venom in her voice, "Such an unexpected turn of events, dear Kathy. Though I suppose in times of crisis one must be practical." Jack smoothly redirected the conversation to Mrs. Pemberton's grandson's latest business venture, asking informed questions about the tech startup the young man had launched. He spoke knowledgeably about market conditions and venture capital, effectively neutralizing Mrs. Pemberton's attack before she could draw real blood. When Kathy's college roommate pulled her aside, eyes wide with genuine concern, asking if she was truly all right, if she needed an escape route, if this marriage was something she actually wanted, Jack gave them space, but remained close enough that Kathy could feel his protective presence like a shield she hadn't asked for but desperately needed. "I don't know what I want," Kathy admitted to her friend. The same words she'd spoken to Jack. "But I know I couldn't walk out of that church alone. I couldn't be the girl everyone pitied. And Jack, he stepped up when no one else would." "But do you love him?" her friend pressed. Kathy looked across the room to where Jack stood speaking with her father, his posture relaxed but alert, as though he was simultaneously engaged in conversation and aware of everything happening around him. "I don't know him well enough to love him, but I remember liking him once, when we were children. Maybe that's enough to start with." The morning stretched into afternoon. Caterers served the planned courses, each dish emerging from the kitchen with the same precision and care despite the chaos underlying the celebration. Champagne flowed freely, perhaps too freely, loosening tongues and emboldening the curious. Kathy barely touched her plate, her stomach too knotted with anxiety and adrenaline to process food. Across from her, Jack ate with unhurried precision, occasionally meeting her eyes with a look that asked silent questions. "Are you holding up? Do you need to leave? I'll follow your lead." She didn't know how to answer, didn't know how to process that this man, this stranger who was somehow not a stranger, had just bound his life to hers without hesitation, without apparent second thought, as though stepping in to marry her had been the most natural decision in the world. When the band began playing, tradition demanded a first dance. Kathy's chest tightened at the thought of all those eyes watching, judging, waiting for her to crumble, or for some crack to appear in this hastily constructed marriage. But Jack stood and extended his hand, his expression patient and steady, giving her time to accept or refuse. She took his hand. They moved to the center of the floor, his hand settling at her waist, hers resting on his shoulder. She could feel the warmth of his palm through the thin silk of her dress, the solid strength of his frame beneath the expensive wool of his suit. The music swelled, a waltz she'd chosen months ago with Trevor, back when her future had looked entirely different. Jack led with quiet confidence, guiding her through steps she barely remembered. He held her firmly enough that she felt secure, but gently enough that she could pull away if she needed to. She stumbled once, her heel catching on the hem of her dress, and his grip tightened imperceptibly, steadying her without drawing attention to the misstep, making it appear as though nothing had happened at all. "You're doing fine," he murmured, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "I feel like I'm drowning," she whispered back, the truth escaping before she could stop it. His eyes found hers, and something in their depths made her breath catch. "Then let me be your anchor, for as long as you need one." They turned, swayed, moved through the choreography of a marriage that felt both absurd and achingly real. Kathy became hyper-aware of every point of contact, his hand warm and steady against the small of her back, his fingers intertwined with hers, the mere inches separating them as they moved in sync. He smelled like cedar and something crisp she couldn't identify, expensive and subtle. Her heart pounded far too hard for a man she barely knew anymore. Far too hard for what should have been a convenience, a rescue mission, an act of charity or perhaps even pity. But there was nothing charitable in the way Jack held her. Nothing distant or detached. He danced with her as though she were precious cargo, worth guarding, worth claiming. As though this dance meant something more than public performance. When the song ended, he didn't immediately release her. For a suspended moment, they simply stood there, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough that the rest of the room seemed to fade into irrelevance, close enough that she could feel his breath and count the beats of his pulse at his throat. Then reality crashed back in. Applause. More curious stares. The weight of a future she hadn't chosen, but somehow agreed to anyway. As Jack finally stepped back, his hand trailing away from hers with what seemed like reluctance, Kathy felt the ghost of his touch linger on her skin and wondered if she'd just made the most reckless decision of her life, or the only one that would ever truly matter. Three days after the wedding, Kathy and Jack attended a charity brunch at the Belmont Club, one of those obligatory social events that their families' positions demanded. The invitation had arrived weeks ago, addressed to Mr. Trevor Ashford and Miss Catherine Vanderot. Someone had crossed out the names and handwritten in Mr. and Mrs. Jack Alden, with what Kathy imagined was either genuine goodwill or vicious curiosity. Kathy had considered feigning illness, but her mother's pointed phone call made clear that hiding would only fuel more gossip, make her appear ashamed or defeated. "You must be seen," her mother had insisted. "You must show them that you're happy, that this marriage is real. Otherwise they'll tear you apart." Jack arrived at the Vanderot estate to collect her, driving himself rather than sending a car, dressed in a navy suit that made him look every inch the billionaire he was. Understated, expensive, perfectly tailored to his frame. His car was a sleek black sedan that whispered wealth rather than shouted it. The kind of vehicle that spoke of confidence rather than insecurity. The drive to the Belmont Club stretched in comfortable silence. Jack didn't press her to talk, didn't fill the air with meaningless chatter or false reassurances. He simply drove, one hand on the wheel, occasionally glancing over to check on her with eyes that seemed to see more than she wanted to reveal. "You don't have to do this if you're not ready," he said finally, as they pulled up to the club's entrance with its colonial columns and manicured hedges. "We can turn around. I'll handle whatever fallout comes from our absence." "No," Kathy said, surprised by the firmness in her own voice. "I need to face them eventually. Might as well be now, while I still have momentum." Something that might have been admiration flickered across his expression. "Then let's go show them what they're dealing with." The Belmont Club buzzed with the cream of society, all gathered under the guise of raising funds for the Children's Hospital. Crystal clinked against china, laughter rang out just a bit too loud, designer dresses swished across imported marble. But Kathy knew the truth. These events existed to trade information, to assess social standings, to determine who was rising and who was falling in the complex hierarchy of their world. She braced herself as they entered, Jack's hand settling lightly at the small of her back, a gesture of unity, of protection, of public claiming. The touch sent warmth spreading through her despite the cool air conditioning. The whispers started immediately. Heads turned with the subtlety of hunting dogs catching a scent. Conversations paused mid-sentence, then resumed in lower tones. Kathy felt her cheeks burn, but Jack guided her forward with unwavering confidence, as though he couldn't hear the speculation crackling through the room like electricity, as though walking into a room full of judgment was something he did every day without a second thought. They made it through the first hour. Jack introduced her to business associates she'd never met, men who controlled hedge funds and venture capital firms, women who sat on the boards of major corporations. They treated Jack with the kind of respect reserved for equals, and Kathy noticed how they watched him differently now, with new interest, perhaps wondering what had prompted the notoriously private Jack Alden to suddenly enter the marriage market, and what it meant that he'd done so under such dramatic circumstances. "Your wife," one silver-haired investor said, the words still sounding strange and new. "I understand you two knew each other as children." "We did," Jack confirmed, his hand remaining steady at Kathy's back. "Sometimes the best things in life are worth waiting for." The comment seemed innocuous enough, but Kathy caught the implication, that he'd waited for her, that this marriage wasn't impulse but something deeper. She didn't know if he truly believed it, or if he was simply constructing a narrative that would protect them both from speculation. Then Victoria Harrington appeared. Kathy had known Victoria since prep school, back when they'd competed for the same spots on the debate team, the same invitations to exclusive parties, the same attention from boys who mattered. Victoria had always won with cruel efficiency, her beauty as sharp as her tongue, her ambition barely concealed beneath expensive manners. Kathy, "Darling," Victoria's smile could cut glass, her tone dripping with false warmth. "Congratulations on your impromptu nuptials. How wonderfully spontaneous of you. So modern." Jack's presence beside Kathy stiffened almost imperceptibly, a tension that only someone paying close attention would notice. "Thank you, Victoria," Kathy managed, her voice steadier than she felt. Victoria's gaze slid to Jack, assessing, calculating, taking in every detail from his expensive watch to his hand resting possessively at Kathy's waist. "Jack Alden. I don't think we've been properly introduced, though of course everyone knows who you are. You're something of a legend, aren't you? The man who says no to everything." She extended a perfectly manicured hand, her nails painted the same blood red as her lips. "Victoria Harrington." Jack shook her hand briefly, politely, the contact lasting barely 2 seconds before he immediately returned his attention to Kathy. A subtle dismissal that Victoria clearly noticed, her smile tightening fractionally. "You know," Victoria continued, her tone shifting to something that might have passed for sympathy, if not for the glint in her eyes. "Some women just can't hold on to a man, can they? Though I suppose when you're desperate enough, any replacement will do." The words landed like acid, burning through the thin armor Kathy had constructed. She felt her composure crack, felt the familiar shame rising hot and suffocating in her chest. Around them, conversations quieted. People leaned in, sensing blood in the water, drawn to the drama like sharks to chum. But before Kathy could formulate a response, before she could summon the strength to defend herself, Jack spoke. His voice remained calm, almost conversational, but something cold and lethal threaded through it, the kind of tone that made people in boardrooms reconsider their positions. "Funny. If that's true, why is it my wife had more proposals than she could count, from men worth 10 of most in this room, and still managed to make me the luckiest man alive?" He paused, letting the words settle, his gaze never leaving Victoria's face. Not everyone could inspire that kind of devotion, though I suppose not everyone would understand what it means to be genuinely wanted, rather than strategically pursued. The silence that followed was absolute, profound, the kind that made people hold their breath. Victoria's smile froze, her expression crystallizing into something brittle. Her eyes darted between Jack and Kathy, searching for the joke, the sarcasm, anything to reclaim the upper hand she'd just lost. But Jack's expression held nothing but cool certainty, as though he'd stated an irrefutable fact, rather than delivered a perfectly aimed strike. Other guests shifted uncomfortably. Someone coughed. A glass clinked too loudly against a plate. Victoria's mouth opened, closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. "Well," she finally managed, her voice thin and strained. "How Lovely for you both. She retreated with as much dignity as she could salvage, her heels clicking rapidly across the marble floor. On the drive home, Kathy stared out the window, replaying his words. My wife had more proposals than she could count, and still managed to make me the luckiest man alive. And wondered if Jack truly believed what he'd said, or if he'd just proven himself the most skilled protector she'd ever known. The days that followed established an unexpected rhythm, a pattern that felt both strange and increasingly natural. Jack had moved into the Vanderot estate's guest wing temporarily, a practical arrangement while they decided on more permanent living situations. The wing had its own entrance, its own sitting room, enough space that they could maintain separate lives while technically sharing the same address. Kathy's parents seemed relieved by his presence, as though his steady competence could somehow restore order to the chaos Trevor had left behind. Her mother stopped crying in the mornings. Her father returned to his usual routines rather than pacing his study with barely contained rage. Mornings. Kathy found Jack already awake, reading the financial news over coffee in the conservatory that overlooked her mother's prized garden. He'd look up when she entered, a small smile softening his usually serious expression, and ask if she'd slept well. The question never felt like mere politeness. It felt like genuine concern, as though her rest mattered to him in ways she couldn't quite understand. He didn't crowd her, didn't demand anything, simply existed in her space with quiet constancy, like gravity, invisible but essential, shaping orbits without announcement. One afternoon, she found him in her father's study, reviewing documents related to the Vanderot family's charitable foundation. Her mother had mentioned casually over breakfast that they needed a new treasurer after the previous one retired to Florida, and apparently Jack had volunteered to audit the accounts and ensure everything was in order. You don't have to do this, Kathy said from the doorway, watching him work. Jack glanced up, his reading glasses perched on his nose in a way that made him look somehow more approachable, more human. I know. But your family's foundation does important work, the children's literacy programs, the scholarship funds. And I have the expertise. Why not use it? She stepped into the room, drawn by curiosity and something else she couldn't name. What made you so successful? The question emerged before she could stop it, before she could wonder if it was too personal, too direct. Everyone talks about how you turned your inheritance into something enormous, but no one ever says how. He leaned back in the leather chair, considering her with those dark eyes that always seemed to be calculating, measuring, understanding. I paid attention to what others overlooked, found value in places people didn't think to look. His gaze held hers, and I never gave up on things worth fighting for, even when everyone else said they were lost causes. Something in his tone made her pulse quicken, made her wonder if he was still talking about business, but she pushed the feeling aside. The weeks accumulated like pearls on a string, each day adding to a collection she hadn't planned to build. Jack learned her rhythms with unsettling accuracy. Knew she preferred tea to coffee in the evenings, that she grew quiet when overwhelmed rather than vocal, that she loved old movies from the 40s and 50s but pretended not to in front of her society friends who considered such things beneath their sophistication or too old-fashioned to be worth discussing. He began leaving small things for her. Tokens that appeared without fanfare or explanation. A first edition of her favorite novel, placed on her nightstand with no note, no expectation of thanks. Her favorite pastries from the French bakery across town, almond croissants and pain au chocolat, appearing at breakfast when she'd had a particularly difficult day before, when she'd come down to dinner with red-rimmed eyes and excused herself early. Tickets to a gallery showing an artist she'd mentioned once in passing, slipped under her door with a simple, "Thought you might like this," scrawled on the envelope in his precise handwriting. He didn't ask to accompany her, didn't expect reciprocation, just provided the opportunity and stepped back. Each gesture felt effortless, as though taking care of her required no thought at all, just natural inclination, as instinctive as breathing. One evening, she found him cooking in the kitchen, having given the staff the night off. The sight stopped her in her tracks. Jack Alden, billionaire recluse, standing at the commercial-grade stove in rolled-up shirt sleeves, preparing what smelled like Italian food. Something rich with garlic and tomatoes and fresh herbs. "You cook?" she asked, incredulous. He glanced over his shoulder, amusement dancing in his eyes, transforming his serious features into something warmer. "I lived alone for years after college. It was either learn or survive on takeout. I preferred learning." She pulled up a stool at the kitchen island, watching him work with the same focused precision he brought to everything. His hands moved with confidence, chopping vegetables with professional efficiency, stirring sauce at exactly the right intervals, tasting and adjusting seasonings with the certainty of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. "What are you making?" "Pasta primavera. You mentioned once, years ago at some garden party, that it was your favorite. Your mother was serving it, and you told mine that you could eat it every day and never get tired of it." He shrugged, a gesture that somehow seemed vulnerable coming from him. "I don't know if that's still true, but I thought it was worth trying." Kathy's chest tightened, emotion flooding through her so suddenly she had to grip the edge of the counter. "You remembered that?" "We must have been 10 years old. 9, actually. It was your 9th birthday." He looked up from the pan, meeting her eyes. "I remember everything about you, Catherine. Every conversation, every smile, every moment you let me exist in your orbit. Some people might call that pathetic. I call it paying attention to what matters." The words hung between them, simple and devastating. He said them without drama, without expectation of response, just fact, delivered in his characteristically straightforward way. They ate together at the kitchen table rather than the formal dining room. No staff hovering, no pretense of grandeur. Just the two of them, sharing a meal he'd prepared with her in mind, sharing space in a way that felt both intimate and safe. Jack asked about her day, listened when she spoke about the art history course she'd been thinking about auditing at the university, something she'd wanted to do for years, but had shelved because Trevor thought it was a waste of time, that she should focus on charity work and social connections instead. Jack's response was immediate and unequivocal. She should enroll, should pursue whatever interested her, should stop living according to other people's definitions of worthwhile. He offered observations that proved he was truly paying attention rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk. He remembered the professor she'd mentioned wanting to study under, asked intelligent questions about the Renaissance artists she loved, admitted his own knowledge was limited, but his interest was genuine. For the first time since Trevor left her at the altar, Kathy laughed. Really laughed, the sound bubbling up from somewhere deep and genuine, over something Jack said about his mother's persistent attempts to redecorate his apartment, in what she called appropriate style for a man of his standing, all heavy, drapes and antique furniture that he kept politely refusing, preferring the minimalist modern aesthetic he'd chosen himself. "She actually hired a decorator without telling me," he said, shaking his head with fond exasperation. "I came home to find my living room full of Victorian furniture and oil paintings of horses." "Horses, Catherine. I don't even like horses. What did you do?" Thanked her profusely, waited until she left, then had everything returned the next day. She still brings it up at family dinners. Tells everyone I have no appreciation for classic elegance. When she caught herself smiling at him across the kitchen table, warmth spreading through her chest, she felt something shift inside her. A crack in the armor she'd built around her heart. A loosening of the tight control she'd maintained over her emotions since the wedding. That night, lying in bed with the moonlight streaming through her windows, Kathy realized she'd gone an entire evening without thinking about Trevor once. And the only face in her mind when she closed her eyes was Jack's. The way he'd looked at her while cooking, the warmth in his eyes when she laughed, the careful way he'd said her full name like it was something precious. Margaret Alden arrived on a Saturday afternoon, sweeping into the Vanderot estate with the kind of energy that filled rooms before she even spoke. Jack's mother had been elegant in her youth and remained striking in her 60s, with silver hair styled in a modern cut and the kind of bone structure that aged beautifully. She embraced Kathy warmly, then held her at arm's length to examine her properly. "Let me look at my daughter-in-law," Margaret said, her eyes, the same dark brown as Jack's, taking in every detail. "You've grown into a beautiful woman, Kathy, though I always knew you would. Even as a girl, you had that quality about you. They settled in the drawing room for tea, a formal affair that Kathy's mother insisted upon, though Margaret seemed far more interested in conversation than ceremony. Jack sat beside Kathy on the settee, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, a united front against whatever interrogation might come. But Margaret's questions weren't intrusive. They were warm, curious, genuinely interested in how Kathy was adjusting to married life, whether she was happy, whether Jack was taking proper care of her. The concern felt maternal rather than judgmental, and Kathy found herself relaxing despite her earlier anxiety about this meeting. "I have to admit," Margaret said, setting down her teacup with a knowing smile, "I wasn't entirely surprised when Jack stepped forward at the wedding. Shocked, certainly. The circumstances were extraordinary, but not surprised. Not really." Kathy glanced at Jack, who'd gone very still beside her. "What do you mean?" Margaret's smile grew wistful, nostalgic. "Has my son never told you about his childhood devotion? How he used to follow you everywhere when you were young? Catherine Vanderot was all he talked about from the time he was 5 years old. Mother, did you see how fast Kathy can run? Mother, Kathy likes strawberries best. Mother, Kathy's dress was blue today and it matched the sky." Kathy felt heat creep up her neck, acutely aware of Jack's presence beside her. "I remember he was always around. I thought he was shy." "Oh, he was shy with everyone else," Margaret laughed. "But with you? With you he was brave. He'd do anything to make you smile. Once, when you were about 8, you mentioned you wished you could see the ocean from your bedroom window. Jack spent the entire afternoon drawing pictures of the ocean, dozens of them, and tried to tape them to your windows so you'd have a view. Your mother found him on a ladder with a roll of tape and a stack of crayon drawings. The image struck Kathy with unexpected force. A young Jack, earnest and determined, trying to give her something she'd casually wished for. "I don't remember that." "You were at a music lesson," Margaret said gently. "He wanted it to be a surprise. Your mother kindly explained that tape wouldn't work on the windows, but she let him keep 3 of his drawings in your playroom. You probably never knew where they came from." Kathy did remember those drawings. Bold, childish renderings of waves and boats, signed with a wobbly J.A. in the corner. She'd thought they were just decorations her mother had chosen. "When we moved to California, he cried for weeks," Margaret continued, her voice softening with memory. "Not because he was leaving his school or his friends, but because he was leaving you. He'd ask me every day if we could write to you, if we could visit, if maybe you'd come see us. I tried to explain that childhood friendships often fade with distance, but he wouldn't accept it. He kept every photo he had of you, usually you in the center of some group, him somewhere in the background watching." Jack stood abruptly. "Mother, I'm sure Catherine doesn't need to hear—" "Sit down, darling," Margaret said firmly but kindly. "She's your wife. She should know what she means to you, what she's always meant." Jack remained standing, his jaw tight. But Margaret continued undeterred. Even in high school, in college when other boys were dating and falling in love, Jack never seemed interested. Oh, he was polite to the girls who approached him, and plenty did, especially once it became clear he was building something substantial with his investments. But he never pursued anyone, never let anyone get close. I used to worry. Wonder if something was wrong. If he was afraid of intimacy or carrying some wound I couldn't see. She looked at her son with infinite tenderness. But then one day, when he was about 25, I found him looking at those old photos again. And I asked him directly, why did he keep pushing everyone away? Do you know what he said? Kathy shook her head, unable to speak, her heart hammering against her ribs. He said, because none of them are her. And I'd rather wait a lifetime for something real than settle for something convenient. Margaret's eyes glistened with tears. I told him he was being foolish, that you'd probably married someone else by then, that childhood infatuations weren't meant to last. He just smiled and said, then I'll be alone. I've made my peace with it. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of the antique clock on the mantel. Kathy couldn't look at Jack, couldn't process what she was hearing, couldn't reconcile the man who'd built a billion-dollar empire with the boy who'd cried when he had to leave her, who'd carried her picture for 2 decades, who'd apparently decided at 25 that he'd rather be alone forever than be with someone who wasn't her. When the wedding invitation came, Margaret said quietly, I made him attend. I thought it would give him closure, a chance to see you happy and finally move on. I never imagined—" She trailed off, shaking her head in wonder. "But when that young man left you standing there, when I saw you so hurt and desperate, I looked at Jack, and I saw something I'd never seen before. Not sadness, not resignation, but possibility." Kathy finally turned to Jack, who stood by the window, his back partially to them, his shoulders rigid with tension. "Jack," he didn't turn. "Everything she said is true. I won't apologize for it or explain it away. I loved you when I was 5 years old, and I loved you at 12 when we moved away, and I loved you at 25 when I decided I'd rather build a life alone than pretend to feel for someone else what I felt for you." His voice was low, controlled, but she could hear the emotion running beneath it like a current. "I loved you 3 weeks ago when I walked into that church, and I love you now. That's not going to change." That night, Kathy lay awake staring at the ceiling, Margaret's words echoing in her mind. He'd rather wait a lifetime for something real, and wondered how she'd been so blind to a devotion that had apparently shaped an entire life. Gossip, like all living things, grew when fed, and society fed it well. The story of Kathy's wedding had spread beyond their immediate circle, making its way into society columns and online forums, where the wealthy and connected were discussed with the same fervor as celebrities. Was this a pity marriage? Had Jack Alden felt sorry for poor abandoned Kathy Vanderot? Or was there some financial arrangement between the families, some old debt being paid? The speculation followed them everywhere. Whispered conversations that stopped when they entered rooms, knowing looks exchanged over champagne glasses. The weight of judgment pressed down on Kathy's shoulders until she felt herself shrinking under it, becoming smaller, less certain of her right to take up space. The business gala was unavoidable. Jack's company was receiving an award for innovation in sustainable technology, and his absence would be noted and criticized. Kathy had spent hours preparing, choosing a midnight blue gown that her mother promised was perfect, having her hair and makeup done professionally, trying to construct an armor of beauty and elegance that might deflect the cruelty she knew was coming. Jack arrived to collect her, stopping in his tracks when he saw her descending the staircase. Something flickered across his face. Wonder, perhaps, or hunger, or both, before his expression settled back into its usual composed mask. "You look beautiful," he said simply. But the way he looked at her made the words feel like so much more. The gala was held at the Metropolitan Museum, the venue glittering with lights and filled with everyone who mattered in business and technology. Jack's hand remained at the small of her back as they navigated the crowd, a constant presence that had become familiar over the past weeks, comforting in its steadiness. They'd made it through cocktail hour, through the presentation where Jack accepted his award with a brief, gracious speech that somehow managed to thank everyone while revealing nothing personal. They were standing by one of the museum's installations, champagne in hand, when Kathy overheard the conversation. 2 women, wives of tech executives, dressed in designer gowns and wearing jewelry worth more than cars, stood just close enough that their words carried. They had to know Kathy could hear. That was the point. "I still can't believe Jack Alden married her," the first one said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "I mean, what was he thinking? A girl dumped at the altar doesn't exactly scream prize, more like damaged goods." "Maybe he felt sorry for her," the second one replied. "You know how wealthy men are sometimes. They need a charitable cause. Though I would have thought he'd donate to an actual charity rather than saddle himself with someone so publicly humiliated." Kathy felt the words land like physical blows, each one finding the soft, vulnerable places where her confidence was still broken. She took a step back, instinctively trying to flee, but Jack's hand at her back stopped her. His entire body had gone rigid. When he turned toward the women, his expression was terrifying in its coldness, the kind of look that probably made people in boardrooms reconsider their career choices. "Excuse me," Jack said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise with precision. Both women turned, their faces paling as they realized he'd heard every word. "I couldn't help but overhear your assessment of my wife." The first woman attempted a smile. "Oh, Mr. Alden, we were just—" "Let me offer you a correction," Jack interrupted, his tone cordial but laced with steel. My wife, Catherine, is not damaged goods. In fact, if being the most graceful, resilient, intelligent woman I know isn't a prize, then the world's standards are broken. He paused, letting the words sink in. She faced public humiliation with more dignity than most people show on their best days. She picked herself up when she had every right to fall apart. She chose to move forward rather than hide. Those aren't the qualities of someone who's less than. Those are the qualities of someone extraordinary. The crowd around them had gone quiet, people turning to listen, to witness. And if you think I married her out of pity, Jack continued, his voice dropping to something even more dangerous, you fundamentally misunderstand how the world works. I have enough money to solve almost any problem. I don't need to marry someone to practice charity. I married Catherine because she's the only woman I've ever wanted, the only person I've ever loved, and the only future I've ever imagined. If that makes me charitable, then every person who's ever chosen love over convenience is a philanthropist. His gaze swept over both women, dismissing them without another word. Now, if you'll excuse us, I'd like to dance with my wife. He guided Kathy toward the dance floor, his hand steady at her back, even as she trembled with a mixture of emotions she couldn't name. Shame, gratitude, something dangerously close to love. They found space among the other couples, and Jack drew her into his arms, closer than they'd danced at the wedding, close enough that she could feel the rapid beating of his heart beneath his tuxedo jacket. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, I did. His voice was fierce, protective. I won't let anyone diminish you, Catherine. Not in front of me. Not ever. She looked up at him. This man who'd stepped out of the shadows of her childhood to become her defender, her protector, her husband. He'd just publicly declared his love for her in front of hundreds of people who would dissect every word, and he'd done it without hesitation, as though her honor was worth more than his privacy, as though defending her was more important than maintaining the distance he'd carefully constructed between himself and the world. Why? She asked, the question encompassing everything. Why had he married her? Why did he protect her? Why did he care so much about a woman who'd barely noticed him as a child? His eyes held hers, dark and intense, and filled with something that made her breath catch. Because you're worth it. You've always been worth it. And I need you to start believing that. In the car ride home, Kathy sat in silence, Jack's words echoing in her mind. The only woman I've ever wanted, the only person I've ever loved, the only future I've ever imagined, and felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been locked away since Trevor walked out of that church. Every interaction grew charged after that night, weighted with meaning neither of them spoke aloud. The air between them hummed with possibility, with words unspoken and feelings that pressed against the boundaries they'd established. Kathy found herself hyper-aware of Jack's presence in ways she'd never experienced. The sound of his footsteps in the hallway, the cedar scent of his cologne lingering after he'd left a room, the way her pulse quickened when she heard his voice. She caught herself reaching for his steadiness like a lifeline, seeking his opinion on decisions both large and small, finding excuses to be in the same room even when practical necessity didn't demand it. And Jack, for his part, seemed to be exercising increasing restraint, as though the control he'd maintained for weeks was beginning to fray at the edges. The touches multiplied. Accidental. Necessary, each one sending electricity through her system, his hand at her elbow guiding her through a doorway, his fingers brushing hers as he handed her a cup of tea. The way he steadied her when she stumbled on the estate's front steps, his hands at her waist for just a moment longer than required before he stepped back with visible reluctance. One evening, they attended a dinner party at the Hawthorns' estate, another unavoidable social obligation. The gathering was smaller than the gala, more intimate, which somehow made it more dangerous. Kathy wore a deep emerald dress that her mother had helped her choose, and when Jack saw her, something flashed in his eyes that made her feel powerful and desired and terrifyingly vulnerable all at once. Throughout dinner, she was acutely aware of him beside her, the way he leaned in to hear her speak when the conversation around them grew loud, the way his attention never fully left her even when speaking to others, the way his hand occasionally found hers beneath the table, squeezing gently in silent communication. After dinner, As guests mingled in the Hawthorns' garden beneath strings of fairy lights, Kathy stepped away to catch her breath. The evening was warm, the air heavy with the scent of jasmine and roses. She walked toward the far end of the garden, where a stone fountain burbled peacefully, seeking a moment of solitude to process the feelings swirling through her. She didn't hear Jack approach, but suddenly he was there, materializing beside her in that quiet way he had. "Are you all right?" he asked, concern threading through his voice. "Yes," she said, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just needed air. Needed to think about." She turned to him. This man who'd become central to her life in just a few weeks, who'd defended her and protected her, and seen her at her lowest and never once made her feel less than precious. About how my life isn't what I planned, how none of this was supposed to happen, how I should probably feel lost or scared or regretful. She paused, holding his gaze. "But I don't. I feel found." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the controlled facade he usually maintained. "Catherine, let me finish," she said quickly, courage flooding through her. "You've been so careful with me, so patient, never pushing, never demanding. But Jack, I need you to know that you don't have to keep pretending this is just convenience or rescue or obligation. I see you. I see how you look at me when you think I'm not paying attention. I see how you position yourself between me and anything that might hurt me. I see how you remember every small detail, how you leave me favorite things, how you've rebuilt my confidence piece by piece without ever making it obvious what you were doing." He'd gone very still, barely breathing, his eyes locked on hers with an intensity that made her knees weak. "I was blind as a child," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I didn't see that the quiet boy following me around wasn't shy. He was devoted. I didn't understand that his presence wasn't coincidence. It was choice. Every single time. You chose to be near me. You chose to remember me. You chose to wait for me." Her voice cracked. "And then you chose to marry me when I was at my absolute lowest, when I had nothing to offer you except humiliation and gossip and a broken heart." "You had everything to offer," he said roughly, his control slipping. "You've always had everything." They stood mere inches apart, the fountain behind them providing a soundtrack to a moment that felt suspended outside of time. Kathy could see the pulse beating at Jack's throat, could feel the tension radiating from him like heat. "I'm not asking for promises or declarations," she whispered. "I just need you to know that when you touch me, even accidentally, I feel it everywhere. When you defend me, I feel seen in a way I never have before. When you look at me like you're looking at me right now, I forget how to breathe." "Catherine," he breathed, her name both prayer and curse. His hand lifted, trembling slightly, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. The touch was feather-light, but it burned. If we cross this line, I won't be able to go back. I won't be able to pretend this is anything other than what it is." "What is it?" she asked, though she thought she knew, hoped she knew. His thumb traced along her jawline, a touch so gentle it felt like worship. "Everything. You're everything. You always have been." The moment stretched, both of them balancing on the edge of something irreversible. Then Jack's hand dropped away, though the movement looked like it cost him physically. "Not here," he said quietly. "Not in someone else's garden at a party where people are watching. Not when our first real moment together would become fodder for gossip. You deserve better than that. You deserve everything, and I'm going to make sure you get it." Alone in bed that night, Kathy pressed her fingers to her jaw where Jack had touched her, the sensation still burning on her skin, and admitted to herself what she'd been denying for weeks. She no longer felt broken or rescued or pitied. She felt wanted, chosen, and desperately, terrifyingly in love with her husband. The Vanderot family gathering had been scheduled for months, long before Trevor's abandonment, long before Jack became part of the family. It was an annual tradition, cousins and aunts and uncles converging on the estate for a weekend of tennis, and elaborate meals, and the performance of family unity that their circles demanded. Kathy had dreaded it, knowing that even family wouldn't spare her from speculation and thinly veiled questions about her marriage. But Jack had simply packed a weekend bag, moved his things from the guest wing to to the room adjacent to hers. Finally, bridging that last physical distance, and prepared to face whatever came with the same steady calm he brought to everything. The weekend passed in a blur of introductions and reintroductions, Jack fielding questions about his business ventures and his plans with gracious vagueness. He charmed her elderly aunts with genuine interest in their stories, impressed her uncles with his business acumen, and won over her younger cousins by actually listening when they spoke, rather than dismissing them as children to be patronized. But Kathy noticed something else too. How he stayed close to her. How his eyes tracked her movements across rooms. How he seemed to know instinctively when she needed rescue from a difficult conversation, or when she was genuinely enjoying herself and should be left alone. He'd become attuned to her in ways that felt both foreign and absolutely right. Sunday afternoon, after the main family meal, guests spilled onto the patio for drinks and conversation. The sun hung low in the sky, painting everything gold, and someone suggested a walk through the estate's gardens to see the roses that had just bloomed. Kathy and Jack joined the procession, though they drifted toward the back of the group, content in their own bubble of quiet conversation. They walked slowly, Jack's hand occasionally touching the small of her back to guide her around obstacles, his presence beside her feeling like the most natural thing in the world. "Your family is intense," he said with dry humor. "Your Uncle Robert asked me 15 questions about semiconductor tariffs over lunch." Kathy laughed. "He's testing you, wants to make sure you're worthy of me." "And am I?" The question was light, but his eyes were serious. "I think," she began, but never finished. The patio steps, old stone, beautiful but treacherous, caught her heel. She felt herself falling, the world tilting sideways, her heart lurching with the certainty of impact and embarrassment and pain. But Jack caught her, his arms wrapped around her waist, pulling her back from the fall with reflexes that seemed impossibly fast. She collided with his chest instead of the ground, her hands automatically grasping his shoulders, her face mere inches from his. For a suspended moment, they simply stood there, frozen in an embrace that felt like everything they'd been dancing around for weeks. She could feel the rapid beating of his heart beneath her palms, could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, could feel his breath warm against her face. Neither moved, neither spoke. The world around them, her family, the gardens, the golden afternoon, faded into irrelevance. Then something broke in Jack's expression, the control he'd maintained so carefully finally shattering. His arms tightened around her, not releasing her now that the danger had passed, instead pulling her closer, as though he was done with distance, done with restraint, done with pretending this was anything other than what it had always been. "Catherine," he said, his voice raw with everything he'd been holding back. "I can't do this anymore. I can't keep walking this line, pretending I'm fine with whatever scraps of affection you're willing to give me. I can't keep my distance when every instinct I have is screaming at me to claim you, to make sure you understand exactly what you mean to me." His hands moved to frame her face, gentle but unshakable. "I've loved you from the start. Not from our wedding day, from the very beginning. From the moment I first saw you at some ridiculous party when we were children, when you smiled at me and I felt something lock into place in my chest. I loved you when I followed you around like a lost puppy. I loved you when my family moved away, and I cried myself to sleep. I loved you when I built my company and made my fortune, and everyone asked why I wasn't dating, wasn't settling down, because none of them were you." Tears blurred Kathy's vision, but she couldn't look away, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but listen to words she'd been desperate to hear. "I loved you when I walked into that church 3 weeks ago, and I would have stood at that altar 1,000 times, faced any humiliation, endured any scandal if it meant standing with you. Because, Catherine, you're not my rescue project or my charitable cause or my convenient marriage. You're my everything. You always have been. And I'm done pretending otherwise." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, but she was also smiling, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Then know this," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "I've fallen too. Harder than I ever imagined. So hard it terrifies me. Because I didn't know it was possible to feel this much, to need someone this much, to love someone so completely that the thought of them not being in my life feels like losing oxygen." His thumb wiped away her tears with infinite tenderness. "Say it again." "I love you," she whispered. "I love how you rebuilt me without making me feel broken. I love how you defend me like my honor is more important than your privacy. I love how you remember every small detail and leave me favorite things and look at me like I'm precious. I love how you waited, how you stayed patient, how you let me come to you in my own time. I love everything about you. Jack Alden." "Thank God," he breathed, and then his forehead touched hers, the gesture intimate and reverent. "Because I don't know how much longer I could have waited." They remained in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, their future sealed not by impulse or pity or obligation, but by choice, by love that had waited years to be acknowledged, that had survived distance and time and heartbreak to finally find its home. Around them, the garden bloomed. Behind them, her family likely watched with curiosity and speculation. Above them, the sun began its descent toward evening. But none of it mattered. Nothing mattered except this. The two of them together, their hearts finally aligned, their truth finally spoken. For the first time in her life, Kathy felt not abandoned but claimed, completely, irrevocably, and forever.